I'd argue that naturally, the way that retailers think to grow sales, we've probably reached the limit of that. Now we have to control our costs, and that's led us down this path. We've dressed this up, this ability to project forward and then slice this up into orders. We've classified that as just in time, when our discussion will tell us that perhaps these aren't lean components in the way that we would normally expect them to be. Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in the make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started. Good day, everybody. It's RetailAID and another Conversations for Retailing in 2020 session. So I'm Gary Newbury. I'm a senior exec on call, specializing in rapid performance improvement across retail supply chains and last mile. And today I've got the honor of having Rod Morgan with us, who's an excellent lean expert. We're going to find out a little bit more about lean and how it applies in retail supply chains today. So Rod, would you mind just giving the audience a quick thumbnail sketch of what you're about and some of the things you were found thinking about as this whole pandemic thing is unraveled?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much, Gary. I was really looking forward to this conversation with you, partly because I want to learn more from your perspective. Retail, of course, is something we take for granted. We go out, we purchase what we want, we order it online, and miraculously it arrives at our door, hopefully in good condition and reasonable time, and is good value for money. But behind the scenes, when it comes to retail and the flow of commerce and how product is moved around the world is always fascinated. From a lean perspective, I've been teaching and consulting in lean for probably about 30 years now, maybe even longer. And what I find is that it just becomes ingrained in how you view things. It's a different set of eyes. It's a different perspective, whether you're working inside an organization or standing back and just experiencing the world. The lean mindset actually does change the way you see things and always provides insights into opportunities for improvement. When I think about the supply chain and when I think about retail, the first thing that comes to mind is how many disconnects that entire industry has with what is lean thinking. And I go back to Elihu Goldratt's original discussions on theory of constraints, which is very much, again, aligned with lean thinking. And what are the constraints that exist that cause us to put mass product into containers and then put mass containers onto massively huge ships and ship things all around the world into ports which have to be touched 10 or 20 times prior to it actually arriving at the destination. All of what I've described fundamentally is anathema to lean and the concepts of flow. So I'm looking forward to really having a discussion and learning from you more about the retail side of things and getting your perspective and hopefully sharing with you and the audience some of my thoughts. As we joked about at the very beginning, I don't have all of the answers, and I'm usually the first person to admit I don't even have all of the right questions. But maybe that's what life is all about. It's a voyage of discovery. So let's see where this particular portion of the journey takes us today.
There was something you said just before we jumped on to recording, that in your own practice as a lean expert, you've been trying to encourage more retail people to come into the lean fold and understand that thinking and help the world of retail in terms of its performance and service level and cost to an extent. But you made a statement that despite quite a lot of marketing in that space, that there's been quite a low reception to retail people, retail executives, retail staff actually enrolling into programs that you've been responsible for over a long period of time.
Yeah, I would say definitely it's been disproportionate in terms of attendance, but I could say the same for the federal public sector. You know, if I look at the municipal sector governance, a lot of municipalities across Canada have adopted lean or something like lean in terms of their continuous improvement engine. And to a lesser extent, the provincial governments, and then to an even lesser extent, the federal service. But it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. We're seeing it a little bit slow to the party, so to speak, might be a way of describing it. I know, and I have a lot of great acquaintances and people in my network that are placed within some of the most significant retail giants, including organizations like Walmart. I'm sure that it would only take us a second to find individuals within Amazon and other organizations that are lean specialists in their own right. But putting those specialists in place doesn't change an organization. The fundamental change requires culture change, and it requires a change in the respectful challenging of established paradigms. And maybe over the last year and a half, especially with the difficulties we're seeing in supply chain with port congestion and rising freight costs and restructuring of supply chains now starting to be considered. We've got labor and material shortages. We're dealing with inflation now, which we're not sure where that's going to take us. We've always had problems with reliance on long-term forecasts, especially when there's volatility. And boy, haven't we seen our share of volatility over the last few months or years or so. So I guess what it could be saying is that the supply chain, like all organizations, have leadership that are really trying to figure out how to move forward in the face of uncertainty. And it gives us all a unique opportunity, even at an individual level, to rethink perhaps where we want to go. A good friend of mine that works at the City of London leading their continuous improvement program, he said, we're talking about getting back to better. We have to leverage what we've learned and create something good out of all of this. And perhaps this is the same opportunity for supply chain management and, of course, ultimately retail.
I've got a few points for us to work through. I want to take a few steps back and think about how we got here in terms of the whole design of retail supply chains. And also one of the things that people talk quite comfortably about, retail just-in-time supply chains. I want to talk around that with you, and then perhaps ask you to explain what lean principles basically are within this context, some of the nomenclature, some of the terminology around that, and what's, if we can dive deep into one or two things, what does it actually mean on the ground, and how that relates in turn to retailing or not. And then perhaps, as many companies are trying to start thinking about initially multi-sourcing, multi-shoring, which means putting into different regimes across the world, if that's even possible. And one of those options that I think we're going to increasingly work towards is production to service domestic demand. If we can't do it domestically, maybe we ought to be thinking about just North America and starting to think we've got to wrap our arms around this new NAFTA, the USMCA, but actually start thinking as a continent, how can we build much more resilience and at the same time, much more lean into our system so that we can be much more resilient to whole ranges of challenges, pandemics, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to kick off quickly with a broad background in retailing as to how we got here. So if you bump into the average retailer and ask them, how do they think about retail? Not about the individual categories, but how do they think about the world and how do they drive profits? Well, we'll go straight to their go-to will be build sales. And in the past, that meant building sales meant more sites, more stores. So if you're in a chain store, say 100, you might be thinking, oh, I'll put another 100 in. But then the equation will be, will that actually be a doubling of sales, or do I have to do something else? In which case they might say, well, do you know what? I need bigger stores. So there might be bigger stores. Once we've got bigger stores, guess what we do? We put more stuff in them. We extend product lines. We're adding new categories because our customers are on a journey. We're never quite sure where they're twist and turn next. So we need to support our existing customers with our purpose-based product, the ones that we started off with, and we'll have to add in categories. But the chances are many organizations will find their sales diminishing, diminishing laws of return. The more you have it, the less effective they become. And if we then mirror that into the retail life cycle, and we can either do that at an industrial level, at a category level, or even at an individual retail level, we'll have a growth stage, the e-com business, the digital natives, the existing legacy, but we'll all experience a growth and maturation and ultimately a decline. And the decline is about being oversaturated in the market and being maybe somewhat irrelevant, being surpassed by other competitors. So they're on this curve and they've got three options. One is do nothing and hit what I call the x-axis. The second one is to reinvent, which is sometimes quite taxing for a number of people because it's not a thing we do every day. Let's go and reinvent our brand. It normally takes a lot of energy, lots of imagination, lots of creativity, and often a big capital budget. And the third thing, which seems to be the option that most have gone to, is reduce costs, because we can't grow our sales, but we can manage our costs better. So what we do in stores, we've tended to rein in staff hours. So we look at the profile of customers coming into stores and we've resourced up for that, and at these peripheral times we've reduced store staff. And the second thing, the other big cost, because we can't necessarily change many of our fixed costs in the short term, we look to find sources of cheaper merchandise. So that's necessarily taken us down a path of where can we go in the world where things are substantially cheaper, and the time that the inventory in the pipeline cost of that is much less than the cost advantage of us getting that stock in the first place. So we have naturally gone towards geographically extended supply chains, particularly China and the rest of the Far Eastern countries, because they have three components. They have one, cheap labor, very cheap labor. Initially, it's starting to rise up, but not perceptibly so. Second one is very low levels of regulation. So things that interest the Western world, like human rights and looking after people and the environment, not so hot on those. And the third thing is burning a lot of fossil fuel, because cheap energy allows them to grow their economy. So that's where we get our cost advantage from. That was a natural progression of getting our costs down. So we've now imbibed the way of working. On top of that, we know that because of this length of pipeline, we originally were forecasting demand more often than not, but it was done of perhaps a shorter range. So we might forecast out a season, maybe 2 at the best, but now we're having to forecast out 2, 3, even 4 seasons out. And then we build a forecast, we slice it up into bits, and we place orders on a factory which our competitor might also use. So our ability to share information transparently tends to be a little bit circumspect, because if we share that information, we might share it and it might get back and may cause ourselves a bit of a problem. So I'd argue that naturally, the way that retailers think to grow sales, we've probably reached the limit of that. Now we have to control our costs, and that's led us down this path. And as I say, we've kind of dressed this up, this ability to project forward and then slice this up into orders. We've classified that as just in time, when I think our discussion will tell us that perhaps these aren't lean components in the way that we would normally expect them to be. So that's how just in time has been applied to retailing, but I'm going to hand back over to Rod to help us fill in the gaps.
Well, thank you for that insight. It brings me to a topic that is very much near and dear to my heart, which is about ethical procurement and a chance of re-rationalizing our supply chains. It is a difficult situation. From what you described, I guess we should be just thankful that we can go into any store, consumer goods or food, retail, and actually purchase something at all. There's so many bits and pieces that have to be in motion and integrated to be able to get that product where we can actually consume it. But there's so many opportunities for improvement but I do believe it takes a way of reimagining, perhaps at many levels, and it needs to be driven perhaps even by the public and more consumer awareness as to what they're buying, what they're putting in their mouths, and where it came from. Boy, it's a complex system, and it can't be addressed with specific point of use solutions. It has to be really a holistic approach. But to go back to lean, and Gary, of course, you're a certified Lean Six Sigma black belt yourself. I had the privilege of collaborating with you many, many years ago. Lean is not hard to understand. It's just extremely difficult to do, even at a personal level. And I say personal because that's one of the allures of lean, is that it's common sense, and it can be applied not only at the personal level, but in any sector. So the first principle, as you know, is one of defining value from the customer's perspective. So from a retailer's perspective, it's really understanding voice of the customer. What is it the customer wants from me, or what might they need from me? So even from a point of selling, successful retailers understand the principles of both active selling and latent selling. Selling to active pain, where the customer already has a demand for a product or a service. They have an active need, a wound that needs to be treated. And then really successful retailers will anticipate types of needs that the customer may not even be aware that they have until they're made available to them. And that's an extremely powerful tool for all forms of sales. So voice of the customer is essential. It's the first principle of lean. Understand what is of value from the perspective of the customer. You then have to evaluate the supply chains, the value streams that you employ from moment of demand to demand fulfillment. So it is a closed loop approach. The third element is, as you're evaluating these value streams, you apply what we call the 8 wastes, the way of looking at the flow of value creation. The principle of lean around continuous flow really means continuous single piece flow. Now, if you're outside of automotive and manufacturing, you might say, well, we can't do that. You know, we work in healthcare, we work in all of these industries, and we can't do one piece at a time. We have to batch. There has to be stops and starts. But a purist from a lean perspective would say, I understand that, but that doesn't mean it's okay. We need to respectfully challenge that paradigm. And even if we can't reconcile that constraint, that issue, that non-value added, we're going to still put it on the hit list. And sooner or later, we're going to be able to do something about it. We're going to be able to minimize that constraint or eliminate it altogether. So by identifying and using a tool called value stream mapping, one might think, well, the consumer experience is I walked into your favorite retailer and I bought that love seat. I got it just in time. I walked in, it was exactly what I wanted. I walked out with my love seat just in time. But no, a lean thinker doesn't think that. The lean thinker says, okay, you as a consumer identified a need. What we'll do is we're going to take that need and we're going to put it on a purchase order through a buying office. We're going to source it from Southeast Asia, send them the purchase order. They're going to actually source all of the materials and the labor and the equipment. They're going to build that love seat for you. We're going to then ship it to the docks where we do all of the customs work and paperwork. Now, it can't go right away because that's a huge ship, and we got to wait until all of the other love seats and the assorted stuff get on that container ship. Then we're going to ship that product to a major port, which might be somewhere near you, or it could be in Long Beach, or it could be in Vancouver, you know, wherever the ship ends up going. We're going to then unload it off the ship, but it may be at the bottom, so we're going to have to wait until all of the other containers get off. And then we're going to put those containers in a holding area until we can actually do customs clearance. Then what we'll do is we'll take those containers, if we can find them, and we're going to put them on trucks or trains, and we'll move them to a centralized distribution center. In the centralized distribution center, we're going to do maybe some cross-docking, handling, whatever it is, get it on another truck or a train and ship it off to the local distribution center on your side of the country. At that point, we're going to arrange delivery, maybe to the retail store, but probably we'll ship it to your home. And you'll say, wow, I got that just in time. So a lean thinker doesn't look at lean as being how long it took to get something like that can of beans off of the shelf. The lean thinker looks at the entire life cycle of that process. It's a much broader view. And as you're looking at that process, you're going to find what we call the 8 wastes. Transportation is a waste in the lean world. How do I reconcile that with a logistics professional? How do I go to a porter in a hospital and identify and say, do you realize that moving that patient from the 5th floor to the 1st floor for the MRI was 0 value added? I'm telling you, your job is not value added. The only time that value is being created is when the patient is going through the MRI. Right? So it's a different way of looking at things. Transportation, inventory. Inventory in the lean world is considered a waste. Let's call it a necessary evil, just like transportation. We'll do it because we have to, because the constraints are there that force us to do it. But it doesn't mean we're going to like it. And we're going to be perpetually finding ways to minimize those 2 types of waste, transportation and inventory. What about motion? Waiting and delays. I think we can see a bit of that in the retail world. Overproducing, creating more than is needed in advance of what it's needed. I'm thinking forecasting may play a role in that. And long distances, right? Little's law. The further things are away, the more we're going to have inventory of it to supply demand. Over-processing, doing more things than we really need to be able to create the value for the consumer or the customer. Things not being done right the first time, the flow of information, the entering of the information, damages to products as they're being handled. All of these things would equate to defects. Now, of course, defects can also, in the material handling world, be a risk in terms of bodily injury or worse. And then finally, underutilized talent, skills, people in the workplace that aren't being leveraged to their full capacity. I would never want to pay someone to do inspection, because inspection is a symptom of not doing it right the first time. So technically, their job exists because we can't error-proof this particular stage of the process. So by systematically identifying all of that non-value added, we're going to find in the retail world time being a very precious commodity, and it is a raw material, at least from a human perspective. We see the steady march of time. And when things are consuming time on the clock, you've got to look at every second and say, was value being created at that point? Well, no, there was no value because the product was sitting on a ship. And yes, the ship was moving, but it's still not creating value because it doesn't create value until it's in the hands of the consumer. So I've got 2 things. I've got inventory that's moving. I've got 2 forms of waste going on at the same time, and we're using up the clock. That paradigm shift is the essential piece of what lean is all about. And one might argue and say, well, that's silly. We have to ship by big ships. We have to ship by containers. I was down in Barbados a while back. It was a tough assignment, but someone had to do it. And I was working at the Barbados port, and we were looking at commercial cargo flow. And the challenge was we have these large batches of containers coming in off of the ships. And within each container are multiple orders. And the challenge that I put forth to the team at the port, and they've done a wonderful job since, to improve flow, is where can we decouple from the batch being the container ship that's docked. The minute that container is pulled off the ship, how do we move back to continuous flow? So we're going to live with that inventory issue. But someday, new technology may be reshoring. One of the things that I mentioned to another organization I was working with in Barbados was, they're so reliant on importing products. But in today's world, with 3D printing and other enabling technologies, surely to goodness, if we did an analysis of what we're importing, some of the products we're importing, we could actually manufacture in Barbados. And of course, that would be extremely helpful in terms of, value-added manufacturing, improving the standards of living, reducing some of the reliance on the products being purchased and brought in to the country. So just to recap, and again, you're fully aware of this yourself. There's 5 key principles of lean. Define value, and that becomes your compass north when you're looking at every activity including retail and supply chain. Identify the value streams that are used to deliver that value, the processes, the materials consumed, all of those things that are like tributaries that feed into that value stream from end to end, demand to demand fulfillment. Systematically find ways to either reduce or eliminate the barriers to flow of value creation. Eliminate the waste, identify the constraints, get them out of the system, or at least minimize them based on what you're capable of doing. Move, and this is a strange one a little bit, is move from push to pull. And the best way to think about push is really thinking about the symptoms. Where we see lineups, waiting, delays, queuing, and inventory are all examples in the lean world of a push-based system. We push the product down on the expectation that people will purchase that product. But we're moving into a world, I noticed, I purchased an old James Bond book. I was really happy to find it, Colonel's Son, I think it was called, on Amazon. And I caught a little bit of when I was ordering it, it said print on demand. And I'm wondering what that meant. And I think, you could correct me if I'm wrong, basically that book doesn't exist until I order it. And it's only when I order it do they actually print it. That is a pull-based system. If I go to the casino or the shopping mall or the convenience store or the gas station, there's going to be an automated teller there, ATM. I pull a small amount of inventory, cash, from that machine. It electronically manages its inventory levels to have just in time the right amount of inventory never to run out. And then finally, the fifth element, which is pursuing perfection. Whatever was your current state, your current model of retailing, your current model of supply chain management, becomes a future model with improvements, especially with the enabling technologies that we're seeing, the exponential curve we know that's happening with technology that's been happening for the last 3 or 4 decades. And with that, we need to be able to move to a future state. But at that point, the future state becomes the current state, and we simply start all over again. So hence, a continuous improvement mindset. That's lean in a nutshell. And as I said before, I know you're more than familiar with these topics, but I hope that the viewers of this particular session will be intrigued to learn a little bit more about what is lean, because it's looking at the world, looking at your own personal life in a very, very different way with a different set of eyes.
When you've been brought up on a diet of we're running just-in-time retail systems and it's like accepted, it's done. There's nothing more we can do. We just try and speed it up somehow. What you did successfully unpick was, the fact that we've got 6,000 to 8,000 miles between us. We've got lots of resources that need to be chaperoned, and there's a long delay at the port and a long delay on the ship while it's transporting, a long delay unloading, some transportation to a point of sale. There's a lot that can go wrong there, and a huge amount of waste in there. And what I think retailers have generally done is set themselves goals about things like stock turns and what we call GMROI, and to the point you made about overproducing, baked into many what we call assortment plans and the financial structures around that to actually build in markdowns, because they're saying that we're going to forecast this, but we know we're not going to sell all of it at full margin. We're going to have some way of lowering the price all the way through to clearance and potentially zero price and putting it in the bin, because it's the only way we can get the unit rates from our suppliers and for them to look at us as a viable sales option for their production capability. But so what I'd say is there's so many things that we have to throw up in the air now. And I think that many companies are probably thinking, is there an alternative? And yes, there are, but it's hard work. As I mentioned earlier, domestic demand being made locally. That's a great recipe for future success. But maybe we just need to think a bit wider than that and say that where could we make it at the right level of consistency, quality, cost, reliability in North America? Bearing in mind we have got a free trade agreement that allows us to respond to the customer demand very quickly and contain it within our borders, which are relatively safe from many influences, like one might argue pandemics, global warming, and the other we might be facing over the next century or so. But I think what retailers have gone through is this reduction of inventory, and we'll see it with a lean mindset. When we can reduce inventory, but we actually look at the peripheries around that, the externalities, that's calls, and we go off and address those, so we can actually then drop it down a bit more, see what happens, go and address those. And I think that retailers, generally speaking, when they look at the business as it stands, they want to reduce their inventory because they see that as being cash being used ineffectively, because it's tied up in stock rather than tied up with investing in the future business or paying off a shareholder. And that's led them to squash the inventory balance down. But when there's a slight disturbance in the universe as such, as we've experienced over the last 20 months, we are completely exposed to that 100%, because we're not been picking up that hard work. We've not been recognizing that risk quickly enough to say, okay, we are in a push system because we have been looking at a forecast. We need to rethink that idea in the first place. But while we are where we are, we haven't been doing the hard work that allows us to reduce the stock sensibly. And so I think that's one of the major flaws. We've still been using a forecast. We've been reducing the stock almost as two independent tasks. And we've been convincing ourselves that we've been using a lean technique, I'd argue inappropriately, the just-in-time thing. It's like a complete anti-lean paradigm has been manifested itself in the retail industry, certainly for those ones with geographically extended supply chains. And now they're faced with some big choices ahead, which is, how do we change this whole model? How do we get more demand dependent rather than forecast dependent?
Yeah, I was curious, I mean, just to get your thoughts on it, Gary, is it, and again, just from outside looking in, is that I can remember 20 years or maybe further back in time when Home Depot, for instance, went through a huge rationalization of their SKUs. I think they purged probably 30–40% of their product line. And so when you see retailers doing that type of rationalization to be able to reduce overall inventories, reduce some of the complexity, I can't help be drawn to that Rolling Stones song. You know, you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. Here's what you need, go ahead. I grew up in the Arctic. I probably mentioned this to you before, but from 1967 to 1980, I lived in a place called Iqaluit. It used to be called Frobisher Bay up on Baffin. There was so many wonderful things about growing up there. I spent another 7 years working in Hay River as, of all things, a liquor store manager, and managing all of the distribution for that part of the Arctic, because we were the transportation hub. When I came south, I remember being cautioned a few times, or questioned a few times more, is I'd go into a pub and they'd say, what would you like? And you'd say a beer. And then there would be this pause, and then whoever you're with would say, well, you got to tell them what type of beer. I grew up in a place where you just went in and you said, beer they had is what you would drink. You know, that was it. There was maybe two choices. You'd take either one, it really wouldn't matter. So how do you reconcile in today's world, and this gets me into the other models, like the Amazon model and the cornucopia of choices that people seem to want and need, and how retailers need to be able to respond to that? Because on the one side, the more diverse our stock offerings, the more difficult it is going to be to manage, the greater our overhead costs and so forth. And yet my fear is that if I don't offer that level of selection, I may be losing potential sales. So how do you reconcile the two of those? Is the human dynamic, the human behavior, which seems to be, give me more of everything, and yet rationalizing SKUs would be in the opposite direction.
It's an interesting one, because I think the underlying assumption there is that if we have a very wide assortment, you know, lots of different categories, lots of like very deep and wide, they would call in retail, we would gain customers. Well, we only gain customers when we deliver value. So if we execute against this very wide thing very badly, we're going to have lots of stock in our stores, but not very many sales. So what we found during the early stage of the pandemic in the food industry between the food providers and the grocers, they had to reduce their SKU count, because what happened in production, for those people who are not particularly manufacturing cognizant, is for every time that you change a SKU, you lose a lot of capacity in the setup and change over time. So if you can run one SKU for all day, you can produce a lot of quantity of product, rather than doing 200 SKUs and only producing 10 of each, because that's just what the customer had previously wanted. So between Walmart, Costco, Loblaws, Sobeys, Metro, and people like Conagra, Kraft Heinz, Nestle, whatever, they had to sit down and work on that. And they collaborated. They didn't just like wag the finger. They knew that in order to support all their customers under the different banners, they needed to compromise their approach and understand they had to work with each other. That was a bit of a clue about SKU reduction. But in retail, I still think we can proliferate our SKUs, but if we haven't got the execution processes behind those, if we start going short on inventory on the shelves, or when we get it there in the e-commerce world, we don't execute very well, it doesn't add any great value. What I think we need to do in retail is go back to purpose. What is our purpose? What is the thing? What are we the wrench for that the customer thinks about us in their consideration set and puts us pretty up the top? We're almost to the exclusion of everybody else, because we're very well defined in what it is that we do, and in some ways the why we or how we do that, at least. So reducing our SKUs has a benefit of allowing us to focus on quite a narrow proposition, and the benefit to actually execute against that very well, rather than spreading ourselves quite thinly. The other benefit within the supply chain world is that if we're actually managing 20,000 SKUs rather than 200,000 SKUs, the complexity, it's not just like, oh, the complexity drops off by 90%. It's probably drops off by 99.9%. It's the more you add in, the more complexity you bring in, because it's not who you buy it from, it's the supply chain that sits behind your suppliers. So if you're saying that we're going to expand our proposition and we're going to add in another 100,000 SKUs, which to the average retailer might be quite an excessive number, but say if you're Amazon, they add in 100,000 SKUs, it's nothing, because they've already got somewhere between 600 million and 800 million. Their focus is on the logistics. How do they position this inventory based on predictive analytics? Where's the best position for that? And work out how the logistics works to be able to give that to customers on a 2-day, 1-day, or even same-day basis. But if we're, let's call it the bricks and mortar retail, and we extend our SKU range by 10, 15, 20, 30%, and think this is a good thing, we're going to capture more sales, more demand, and we're going to win more customers, we've also got to be recognizant that each one of those parts is probably made up of 10 or 15 different components, which, if we're working with a geographically extended supply chain, we're talking about a very, very complex, highly dependent supply chain arrangements with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type of suppliers, which we don't control. And so we're going to be at the mercy of that whole arrangement before it even comes to the factory to be finally assembled, packed, assembled into a container and gone through that process that you described, which sounds to anybody listening will be a very onerous approach towards moving products, from source to market.
So Gary, in our conversation about lean and all of the challenges that you're aware of, you've described, where do you see things heading? I can see from a lean perspective, for instance, those organizations, and it's not to say they aren't doing lean. It's just not overt enough from my perspective. I can see the symptom of lean adoption in healthcare is the wave of hospitals and clinics and healthcare professionals attending, taking training, having internal continuous improvement people. Again, you don't have to call it lean, you could call it avocado, but it's an underlying principle. The Toyota production system is well and alive in GM, but they're not going to call it the Toyota production system. Boeing is using the Toyota production system, and Honda, they're all using. So the automotive industry has been, it's had decades and decades of a slow but steady march in terms of quality. I tell my students, just look at the cars we're driving today and the level of complexity and moving parts and non-moving parts and computerized parts that go into making that vehicle work, and compare it to the vehicle quality of 30 years ago. Unless you really run into a lemon, it's almost like the analogy for some of your viewers may not be even aware of back when we didn't have computers, but when we first got computers, we had what we call the blue screen of death. So anyone using a computer would automatically do Control S. That's if you're using a regular Windows operating system. You would automatically save because you never knew when the blue screen was going to come and kill your work. And even to this day, I Control S all the time. It's just force of habit. So the level of reliability we have in automotive and other computers and other types of hardware is astounding. But they've had decades and decades of getting there. And I'm wondering, have we seen a similar transformation in retail and supply chain in general? Or has it been tweaks, so to speak, to the quilt or the blanket, that there's never been that grandiose rethink? And the reason I'm saying this is that if that were to happen, the catalyst for me would be to simply take one of your popular SKUs and truly map it out from a value stream perspective, not from the time you received it and the customer purchased it and walked out the store, but looking at the life cycle of that particular thing they walked out with. They walked in, said, I have a need. We said, wonderful, we've got it here for you. They give it to you. But instead of looking at it from as if they were asking for it and we don't have any on the shelf and it doesn't exist anywhere in the world, except in the manufacturing facility, perhaps, where they do manufacture that part or that thing. What would that actually look like? And what sort of eye-opener might that be to the senior management team? What constraints that they've taken for granted as being, well, that just happens to be the way things are. But now looking at it from a lean perspective, they're looking at it and say, oh my gosh, I mean, all of this waste, the batching that's going on, all of the rework and the handling and the motion and the transportation, and oh, by the way, the clock is ticking while this is all happening. Is there not anything we can do about this? Can we reimagine what we should be doing in the future state based on all of the technologies that we have available? Obviously, I don't think there's just one solution, but it does start with, there's that fabulous little video on YouTube, The Dancing Man. It's Derek Sivers he lives in New Zealand now. He's written a couple of books. And it shows this concert. You assume it's a concert. There's people sitting on the grass on this hill. And there's one chap gets up and starts dancing. And so he does a commentary with it. But eventually another person starts dancing. And what happens eventually is there's a large group dancing, and eventually everyone runs to be a part of this phenomenon. And I'm wondering what would be the tipping point for supply chain and retail management, starting with that first person that's dancing on the side of the hill. What would that look like?
It would require a biblical rethinking of what we do here. I was on a podcast with somebody talking about Agile. It was Oliver Banks, and I said that we need to find a way of getting into the demand, actually responding to demand. And the first reaction that Oliver had was, how do you expect to do that and the underlying assumption was from China, how's that even possible? But actually we should take that question, how do we get closer to demand, to actually shape our thoughts about making certain ideas and concepts highly possible, and then work out how to do that.
That's almost like we're asking the verse, instead of saying, how is that possible? How is that not possible?
When we think about Toyota or GM and these companies that are working with lean principles, there are some attributes around them. I think that proximity is one of them. So you've reduced time. Mm-hmm. The other one, which I think retailers find it sometimes difficult to do, which is sharing and giving good visibility as to what that actual demand really looks like, and sharing that openly across the whole of the supply network that you're working with, so that everybody's got the same picture. One of the things that we often hear about is what we call a bullwhip effect. People It's a bit like just-in-time systems in retail. You just throw it out, oh, it's a bullwhip effect, but we must understand the basic concept of that, which is a lack of trust has given rise to something happening here and being amplified. It's called Forrester's demand amplification effect. So that because I'm guessing what you might need next, i.e. a forecast, I put some extra stock up there just in case, and it doesn't, it goes a different way. Then I have to do a quick run round and try and get what you actually need, put on extra shifts and all the normal stuff in a manufacturing capacity. So we have, I think the basis of how we might move to a lean situation is to actually bring production very close to the point of sale. And of course, in Canada, that might mean just Canada because it's such an immensely geographically spread country, but we have got a few population centres like Toronto, Vancouver, maybe Montreal.
In your conversation with me prior to the call, we talked and you mentioned this concept of rapid changeover, and it made me think immediately of a manufacturer just up the street from me that I'm working with, and they have one machining operation with 5 machines in it, and it's called press brake. And basically you're bending steel. And to be able to change from one product to the other, you have to be able to do a rapid changeover. So in manufacturing, that's referred to as single minute exchange of dies. You can apply it in a healthcare environment. From the minute that the patient's scan was completed on the MRI, how long does it take until the next patient is being scanned? That's considered downtime, non-productive. In manufacturing, what they do is they do something called standardized die heights. So regardless of what I'm doing, when I change over to make another product, I don't have to set the height on the what they call the hit point on the machine anymore, because it's all standardized. Even though the dies are different, they're all made to be the same height. So if we go back to this concept, you know, for supply chains to be more efficient, more effective, we need to be able to reduce the batch sizes. Why can't we? What are the constraints? So one of the discussions I had with students this morning in one of our open enrollment programs was respectfully challenging. So we looked at going through the Ottawa airport, and I had them do a little, you know, gut feel, what does it look like from a value stream perspective? And at the end of the day, no surprise, less than 10% of the time you spend in the airport is actually value added. The rest of it is waiting, transportation, delays, errors, all of these things. Even the students identified what's the root cause of what's happening here at the airport, and it's the plane. Because no, batching is anathema to lean. If you're doing batching, you've got to be able to defend it. There has to be an absolutely good reason. And can you reduce batching? Re-rationalize how you're doing things, like with a rapid changeover in the die. I can afford now, because it only takes seconds to change over from one part to another. I can do very, very small parts. In fact, I can do a part batch size of 1 without impeding the flow of production. So how do we apply that rationale to the supply chain? But again, getting back to the main point I was making is that when we're trying to apply lean in the supply chain, it is about respectfully challenging the paradigms. So and I don't mean this as a slight to the many professionals out there that are far brighter than I am and more informed about supply chain management. But a supply chain manager, you might have a conversation and say, okay, you're about moving stuff. So here we've got a picture of an elevator and we've got a picture of an escalator side by side. And I want you to debate the merits of both modes of transportation. And they would come and say, okay, well, based on my lean thinking, I think the escalator is continuous flow because it's moving. People, you don't wait, you just walk up and it takes you to where you're going. And you say, well, why can't we do that all the time? Well, because, you know, you get to a certain height in the building, it would take longer, be less efficient to get people to much higher floors. So we use the elevator. But they acknowledge that the elevator is a batch. And we can use computers to try and optimize. I remember at the Courtyard Marriott in New York City by Central Park, and I was there with my grandson. And we went to go to the elevators, which are on a kind of a silo. Instead of going up to the elevator and pressing the floor number, you go to a kiosk at the front of the area, and you simply press the floor, and it tells you which elevator to go to. So the computer is trying to minimize the motion, maximize the efficiency elevators that way. We could have that long drawn out debate as to which method is more appropriate, which one is better. But at the end of the conversation, I said, are you asking the right question? And that person would look at me curiously. And I said, you haven't asked why. We're debating which method of transportation is better, the escalator or the elevator. But no one is asking, why are we moving people to begin with? Right? And I know that sounds very wishy-washy and philosophical, but that's what a lean thinker does. They don't analyze the system. They ask the question, why? And sometimes that questioning may lead to an epiphany, a game changer in terms of something so novel that it is something that we can do. Whether it results in reshoring some of the products, whether it finds a new creative way of minimizing the batches, going from very big to small batches. All of these things come from that respectful challenging of established paradigms. And the only thing I'd leave you with is that I need you to get out of your box, but then again, I'm in a box too. How do we collectively all continue to be outside of our own boxes? That every day we look at world and life a little bit differently, and always for the purpose of how can we make this better? And maybe that's what lean thinking is all about.
It's a challenge to the fundamental, what we're doing here. I would argue it's not how can we just improve it, like edge it forward. It's actually, are we actually asking the wrong question? This isn't the solution for the question we should be asking. This is a question, and that leads us to a completely different solution, a much more optimized, value-laden solution to a complex business problem. So I'd just like to wrap this up with a big thank you, Rod. That's incredibly good information for anybody who doesn't know too much about lean, anybody in retailing looking for perhaps a different way of thinking, people in supply chain who often inherit this thing and are asked to change it, but actually what it means is just reduce cost, just change it in only that direction. And maybe there's some tools in there that people can think about and see how they can apply it into their situation. But the point you made fairly early on is, I think lean starts with the person. You know, how do I proceed in my life? You know, how do I make my bed? How do I, arrange my sort of washing utensils in the morning? If you come and see it came into my bathroom, it's all carefully laid out, so I just go from one to the next to the next to the next. I don't have to think. And in some ways that's what we want to do in the concept of retail supply chains. How do we make it the most effective it can be? But it doesn't start from where we are. It starts from the possibilities of what we can do with a different solution.
Absolutely. And to build on that last thought is, no matter what changes take place, first and foremost is understanding what it is the customer needs. What do they need and expect in terms of service and or product? And once in a while, again, like the Rolling Stones song, sometimes you're going to give them something that they actually do want, but they also do need.
So on that note, I'd like to thank you, Rod. Thanks for coming along and sharing your knowledge. Really appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you so much. And I wish you all the very, very best. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.